Welcome, friend, to Sleepy Roman History. If you're new here, this channel is all about quiet stories, softly told, from the dusty corners of ancient Rome. If you enjoy these peaceful journeys through the past, I'd be so grateful if you hit the like button and subscribed. It truly means a lot and helps this little corner of history grow. Feel free to comment where you're listening from. I love knowing how far these sleepy stories travel. Now settle in. Let your shoulders relax. Let the day drift away. Tonight, we're stepping behind the roar of the crowd and into the shadows of the arena. But not for battle. We'll be walking slowly, carefully, through the real life of a Roman gladiator. Not just the games, but the quiet routines, the training, the waiting, the parts history books often skip. Before we begin, it helps to set the scene. The Roman Empire, at its height, stretched across continents, from the sands of Africa to the forests of Britain. In cities large and small, amphitheatres dotted the landscape. Some were grand and famous, like the Colosseum in Rome. Others were modest, built of wood or stone, hosting local crowds who came to cheer, to gamble, or simply to pass the time. But the figures they came to see, the gladiators, were not warriors in the traditional sense. They were trained fighters, yes, but many were prisoners. Some were slaves. Others had volunteered, drawn in by the promise of fame or food, or the strange kind of freedom that existed only inside the arena. To understand the life of a gladiator, we must start not in the Colosseum, but in the ludus, the training schools where they lived, trained, and slept. These schools, often run by former gladiators, were part military barracks, part prison. New recruits, called novitius, were stripped of their old clothes and shaved. Their names were recorded, their bodies inspected, and then their training began. It was grueling. Days started early, with body conditioning, shield drills, footwork. Wooden swords called rudis were used in the beginning, often heavier than real weapons to build strength. They practiced moves over and over, learning the stances, the strikes, the defensive patterns. Some practiced with nets, others with tridents. Some wore heavy helmets with limited vision, training their reactions in the dark. But the schools weren't just about fighting. Gladiators were investments, owned by lanistae, the men who managed the schools and sold their fighters to arena organizers. As such, the men were fed well, kept in shape, and housed in small stone rooms with straw bedding. The food was surprisingly decent, a barley-based diet, rich in carbs and calories, sometimes supplemented with meat or figs. They were given nicknames, outfits, roles to play. Some became secutors with smooth helmets and heavy shields. Others were retiari, using nets and spears. Each class had a counterpart, a rival designed to test their weaknesses. These matchups became crowd favourites, often repeated from town to town like a travelling show. And so, a gladiator's life was a mix of routine and readiness, days of training, nights of rest, and always the looming possibility of being chosen to fight. But before we step into the arena, we'll linger here, in the stillness of the ludus, where torchlight flickers against the walls and the soft sound of sharpening blades hums in the background. The games will come, but for now, let's breathe in the quiet. Let's meet the men behind the armour and let the story unfold softly, one chapter at a time. In the quiet hours before dawn, the ludus stirred gently to life. Before the clang of metal and the bark of orders, there was a brief moment of silence, a breath of stillness, where the stone walls held the warmth of sleep and the scent of ash from the previous night's torches still lingered in the air. Gladiators, whether newly branded recruits or seasoned veterans, rose from their straw-filled mattresses without a word. The routine was carved into them like muscle memory. Daylight was not needed to mark its beginning. The first task was simple but grounding: cleansing. Buckets of cold water were passed around, and each man would splash his face, arms, and chest. There were no luxuries here, no perfumes or oils, just water and grit. A quick rinse of the face, the dust of sleep wiped from eyes hardened by survival. Then came the silent nods, acknowledging each other's presence. Words were sparse this early, as if saving energy for what was to come. Breakfast was served in the central courtyard, where flickering oil lamps cast long shadows across the stone. The meal was plain, but deliberate. A thick porridge of barley, sometimes mixed with lentils or beans. The occasional date or dried fig was a rare treat, reserved for days when a match loomed or when a lanista wished to reward a good performance. Gladiators were nicknamed hordeari, barley men, because of their carb-heavy diets, meant to build bulk and slow bleeding in combat. Seated on rough benches, they ate with focus. No silver utensils or fine plates here, just wooden bowls, chipped from repeated use, and hands calloused from sword grips. Conversation remained minimal. The shared understanding of their fate, their place in the Roman machine, meant there was little left to be said over breakfast. Once the bowls were cleared and the morning light crept across the courtyard tiles, training began. It started, as always, with conditioning, running laps within the ludus, dodging imaginary opponents, working the limbs into alertness. Trainers, often retired gladiators themselves, barked instructions with firm but weary voices. They had seen many rise and many fall. Next came weapons practice. Pairs were assigned, matched by height, weight, and fighting style. Each had a wooden sword, the rudis, heavier than any blade used in the arena. Swinging it repeatedly against a wooden post, the palus was a ritual of its own. Strike, reset, strike again. It trained the arm, the mind, the discipline. Shields were carried too, massive, curved, and weighty, the kind that could break a man's stance if not handled properly. Exercises in balance were common, marching in tight circles with the shield raised, sparring in rhythm, every step rehearsed to exhaustion, and through it all, there was sweat, the kind that clung to the skin and soaked through tunics. Dust rose from the courtyard floor, sticking to damp forearms and bare shoulders. Injuries were common: twisted ankles, bruised ribs, the occasional broken nose. But these were patched with cloth and vinegar. There was no pause for sympathy. By midday, the sun sat high and hot. Shirts, if worn at all, were discarded. Muscles gleamed under the weight of repetition. The lanista would sometimes stroll through the training grounds, hands clasped behind his back, observing with a cold eye. He was part businessman, part warden, always calculating who showed promise, who could be sold for the next match, and who might not survive the next one. When drills concluded, the men returned to their quarters. Silence fell again, punctuated only by the sound of whetstones scraping along blades, or armor being oiled and adjusted. Afternoons, if there was no fight scheduled, were reserved for tactical instruction. Trainers would draw diagrams in the dirt, formations, flanking moves, traps. Gladiators were not just brutes. They were taught strategy, timing, showmanship. Each fight was as much theatre as it was combat. The crowd expected a story, not just blood. But for all the brutality, the school had its own rhythm, one that offered, in its strange way, a sense of stability. Evenings were quieter. Dinner echoed breakfast, a second helping of porridge or stew, eaten slowly in the fading light. Then came rest. Some men played games with carved dice. Others sat in corners, alone with their thoughts. A few whispered prayers to Mars or Fortuna, hoping for favor in the arena. Most just sat in silence, staring at the walls, their bodies sore, their minds rehearsing the next strike. When night finally fell, the lamps were dimmed, the courtyard emptied, and the gladiators returned to their bunks. Another day complete, another night to breathe, another step closer to the sand and the crowd. But tonight, just rest and the quiet. As the golden light of morning gave way to the firm glare of midday, the ludus began to echo with the rhythmic clash of wood against wood. The training arena, a square of hard-packed dirt encircled by tall stone walls, came alive with movement. Every inch of it was scuffed and worn, a testament to the thousands of feet and thousands of blows exchanged over time. It was here that gladiators truly earned their place, and where the weight of the Roman Empire's entertainment expectations settled heavily on their shoulders. The men trained in pairs, often grouped by fighting class. A secutor might square off against a retiarius, the latter wielding a net and trident with slippery unpredictability. Mumiotypes practiced with their curved shields and heavy helms, adjusting to the restricted vision and the strain on their necks. The air was filled with short shouts, trainers' commands, and the dull thud of practice weapons striking padded targets or flesh. At the heart of the arena stood the doctor, the head trainer. His voice carried above the din, barking commands in clipped Latin. He was a former champion himself, a man who had seen the arena from both inside and above, and who now shaped the next generation with a firm but measured hand. His eyes missed nothing. A dropped guard, a slow parry, a sluggish footstep, all corrected in real time with the precision of a sculptor chipping stone. Discipline was everything. The training arena was not merely for building strength, but for cultivating instinct. A true gladiator needed more than brawn. He needed rhythm, timing, an understanding of when to strike and when to hold, and perhaps most importantly, an ability to read the crowd. The audience in the arena would not cheer for chaos. They craved a narrative, tension, suspense, and a satisfying climax. So practice included performance. A glancing blow might be exaggerated for effect, a fall rehearsed to look dramatic but safe. They drilled entrances and exits, learned how to salute the crowd, how to raise their weapons after a victory, how to appeal for mercy with dignity if needed. Even in life or death combat, image mattered. Breaks were short and rare. When granted, they were spent in the shade along the wall, sipping watered wine or chewing on olives, dates, or hard bread. Conversations drifted between soreness, rumours of upcoming matches, or gossip about noble visitors. Occasionally, a Roman patron would come to watch, a senator's son considering a purchase, a wealthy widow seeking entertainment. Gladiators were property, yes, but they also had fans. Some even became minor celebrities, their names chanted in the streets. There was pride in that, for some, and for others, it was a bitter joke. Back in the centre of the arena, mock duels would reach their peak as trainers forced pairs to fight until exhaustion. No breaks, no distractions, just a storm of motion and will. The trainers shouted encouragement and scolded mistakes with equal passion. The dirt flew in every direction. Blows landed hard enough to bruise but not break. Sweat soaked through tunics and fell in drops onto the sun-baked floor. Then, at the end of it all, silence. A single shout from the doctor would halt the frenzy. Weapons lowered, bodies hunched, breathing heavy. And once again, the fighters returned to their starting stances. Again, came the command, and they began anew. Hours passed this way. Repetition burned the movements into their bones. One day, perhaps soon, those movements might save a life, or fail to. The arena showed no mercy for hesitation. Every second here, every drop of sweat, every correction from the doctor was part of a narrow path, one that might end in applause or blood. By late afternoon, the sun began its descent. The light shifted, softening the edges of the courtyard. Shadows grew long, stretching toward the gates that led to the arena beyond. The trainers finally called an end. The men were dismissed, stumbling back to their quarters, chests rising and falling like bellows. Some smiled, proud of their progress. Others limped quietly, haunted by memories of failed blocks or aching wounds. But all carried something forward. Tomorrow they would do it again, and the day after that. Until the gates opened, and the roar of the Colosseum swallowed them whole. As the training yard emptied, the gladiators returned to their celli, modest quarters lining the interior corridors of the ludus. These were not luxurious by any stretch, but compared to the open streets or prison cells many had known, they offered a peculiar kind of peace. Each stone chamber was barely large enough for a simple bed of straw, a few personal items, and perhaps a wooden bench or shelf if the occupant was fortunate. The air inside was heavy with the scent of sweat, dust, and old leather. Boots lined the walls and helmets rested on carved hooks, their cheek guards darkened from use. Some men collapsed immediately, too tired to speak. Others moved slowly, unwinding wraps from wrists and ankles, inspecting bruises and cleaning cuts with water fetched from communal basins. Lamps were lit, small clay vessels filled with oil and fitted with linen wicks. Their orange glow flickered across the stone, softening the room's hard edges and giving it the feel of a catacomb. In that quiet light, stories were sometimes shared, low voices trading tales of distant homes, childhoods in Gallic forests, or mothers left behind in Britannia. The ludus was a melting pot of the empire's reaches, and in these walls, Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, and Roman accents blended like incense in the air. Some men prayed. At a small niche in his wall, one man arranged a figure of Mars, god of war, muttering invocations through chapped lips. Another kept a worn carving of Fortuna, goddess of luck. For gladiators, fortune often held more sway than steel. A lucky fall could mean a spared life. A single coin flipped by a noble in the stands could decide whether a sword was lowered or plunged deep. Dinner was served communally. Slaves from the kitchen brought in bowls of pulse, a barley porridge flavoured with onions or bits of cheese when available. Occasionally, there was salted fish or roasted vegetables, and on lucky nights, a strip of pork. Bread, coarse and brown, was always included, along with watered wine served from tall clay jugs. The dining hall echoed with quiet clinking and murmured conversation. No one gorged or shouted. Training drained much of their energy, and discipline was enforced even at meals. They ate with the same methodical care they used in the arena. Slow, focused, aware. Afterward, the mood shifted. Some men laughed. Not loudly, but enough to warm the room. They told jokes in Latin or broken Greek, teased each other about their poor footwork or exaggerated victory poses. A few sketched battle stances in the dust or practiced footwork in silence. Others sat in corners, carving bone into tokens or polishing the edge of their wooden practice swords. One man sang, a low humming tune from the hills of his childhood, the melody soft and sad. And then, one by one, they retired. Back to their celli, back to their thoughts. Outside, the noise of the city was distant, the hum of Roman life flowing just beyond the walls. Gladiators were part of the public's world, but only when summoned. Until then, they lived in this in-between, warriors in waiting, entertainers in preparation, men caught between death and glory. A few couldn't sleep. Some stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks. Others clutched tokens from loved ones, a lock of hair, a scrap of cloth, a faded letter written in trembling script. There were men here who had survived years in the arena, and others who had yet to fight their first match. They all shared the same uncertainty. They all wondered what awaited beyond the gates. The lamps dimmed, the halls grew silent, and for a moment, the ludus was peaceful. A strange peace, heavy and tense, but real. Tomorrow would bring more bruises, more drills, perhaps even the naming of a new fight. But for now, there was only the sound of slow, even breathing, and the distant howl of wind through narrow streets. The gladiators slept, if they could, beneath the shadow of fate. Before dawn, the ludus stirred with a strange, silent energy. Word had come the night before. Today, the Munera would begin. For weeks, posters had been plastered on walls throughout the city, painted with names, pairings, and even caricatures of famed fighters. The people of Rome had waited. Now the time had come. The doors of the gladiator barracks creaked open, letting in the early morning chill. Trainers barked commands, but even they spoke more softly than usual. This day held weight. It wasn't just another round of sparring or drills. For some, it would be their last day alive. The gladiators lined up in silence, hair oiled, skin dusted with fine sand to absorb sweat, weapons checked and rechecked. Some bore simple tunics, others wore carefully arranged armor, Galea helmets with plumes, Manica arm guards, ochrier greaves that protected shins. No one spoke, unless necessary. Each weapon was chosen with care. Not every gladiator fought the same. Some were retiari, wielding nets and tridents. Others, mummios, carried short swords and heavy shields. There were secutores, thrices, and more, each style demanding a different posture, a different rhythm of violence. These choices weren't just personal. They were calculated for spectacle. Before leaving, many visited the shrine in the corner of the training yard. They knelt before small statues of Nemesis, goddess of fate and vengeance, or whispered prayers to Mars, hoping for strength, speed, or a quick end if that was what lay ahead. And then the procession began. Escorted by guards and trainers, the gladiators marched through the city streets, past curious children and silent onlookers. The Colosseum, vast, curved and towering, rose like a stone wave over the rooftops. Its arches glowed golden in the morning light. The roar of the crowd echoed faintly already, like the wind carrying thunder from far away. Inside, the noise was deafening. Tens of thousands of Romans filled the stands, layered in togas, tunics, and cloaks. Vendors sold honeyed nuts, roasted chickpeas, and watered wine. Children waved small wooden swords, pretending to fight like the men below. It was a celebration, a holiday. For the people, the games were a gift, a spectacle of bravery, pain, and triumph. Beneath the arena floor, the gladiators waited in shadowed chambers called the Hypogeum. They could hear the crowd above, stomping and chanting. Some sat in silence, others paced or flexed their fingers. There were moments of whispered encouragement, of shared glances between old friends. A few men wept quietly in corners, heads bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. A creaking gate, a drumbeat, and then they were called. The sunlight burned as they stepped into the arena. The floor was a flat sea of sand, stained from past battles. Animal cages lined the edges, though they were empty this early in the day. In the centre stood officials, and seated in the elevated pulvinar, a local magistrate raised his hand to signal the start. The match pairings had already been announced. Names were shouted. The crowd roared. And two men, one young and nimble, the other broad and scarred, stepped forward. They saluted. Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant, they said together. Hail, Emperor. Those who are about to die salute you. Even if no emperor was present, the words were tradition, carried on like a hymn. And then they fought. Dust exploded with every step. The clang of blades, the grunt of impact, the shouts of the crowd filled the air. It was not always fast, not always brutal. Sometimes it was a slow dance, parry, step, wait, both men measuring their moves like seasoned actors in a dangerous play. The first match ended with one man disarmed, kneeling, blood trailing down his chest. The crowd howled, demanding a verdict. The official looked to the magistrate. A moment's pause. Then, the thumb signal. It was down. The victor nodded solemnly and struck. The crowd erupted. Somewhere, coins changed hands. A name would be remembered, for a little while, at least. And the day was far from over. More fights followed, pairs, small groups, sometimes reenactments of battles or mythological tales. There was even a break for a comic interlude, where clowns pretended to fight like gladiators, drawing laughter and cheers. But the real matches were what the people craved. And in the waiting chambers, those who had yet to fight sat quietly, eyes closed, listening. Above them, the sun moved slowly across the sky. Cheers rose and fell like waves, and for the gladiators below, the hours ahead were heavy with fate, waiting to unfold. While the crowds focused on the sand-covered floor above, another world moved in the shadows below. The Hypogum, Rome's hidden labyrinth beneath the Colosseum, was alive with motion. Slaves ran with torches and ropes. Animal handlers whispered to caged beasts, and trapdoor operators waited for cues only they understood. It was a delicate machine, churning silently under the thunder of applause. Gladiators who had fought and survived were escorted back down, some limping, others bloodied but triumphant. They were taken to a side chamber where physicians, some more skilled than others, tended to wounds. There were no gentle hands. A dislocated shoulder might be slammed back into place with a grunt and a prayer. Deep cuts were stitched quickly with no time for softness. The priority was always speed, if the fighter was expected to recover in time for future games. Elsewhere, those preparing for battle stood in small groups, or sat alone in corners. Some practiced strikes in the air. Others chewed bitter herbs said to calm the nerves or drank watered-down wine to settle the stomach. The smell of sweat, blood, oil and damp stone filled the air. Trainers walked among them like shepherds watching their flock. They whispered advice, fixed a piece of armour, adjusted a helmet strap. These men had seen too many fights to be romantic about it. They knew which movements won favour with the crowd, how long a duel could last before boredom set in, and what sort of theatrics drew applause. They were not preparing men to survive. They were preparing performers. Up above, a cheer shook the ceiling. In the arena, a wild hunt had begun. Exotic animals, lions, leopards, bears, even ostriches, were released from hidden elevators, charging into open space to chase or be chased by hunters dressed in mythic costume. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and cruel. Sometimes the animals were too frightened to move. Sometimes they went mad. The crowd didn't care. For them, it was excitement, chaos, and entertainment. But that was only the interlude. Back underground, the next wave of gladiators readied themselves. Among them was a man named Gaius, a former blacksmith's apprentice from Gaul. He had been captured during a raid and sold into slavery. His arms were thick, his knuckles scarred from years of hammering metal, not blades. This would be his first match. He stood with a short sword in hand, testing its weight. Nearby, an older retiarius with a net and trident gave him a nod. No words were exchanged. They both knew what waited. The guard at the gate called out names. 2 fighters stepped forward. Gaius's heart pounded, but his name was not among them. He exhaled, not from relief, but from tension that would return in minutes. The chosen men disappeared through the archway leading up. The torchlight flickered on the stone as silence fell again. Time passed differently down there. Minutes stretched, hours collapsed. A man could wait all day and never be called. Or he could be sent up twice in one afternoon if the organizers needed a fill-in. There were no guarantees. In one chamber, wooden boards listed match pairings. A few names had lines drawn through them, men who had died, surrendered, or been too injured to fight again. For some, these lists were the only place their names were ever recorded. No tombs, no inscriptions, just chalk on a board, until it was wiped away. Occasionally, a runner came down with news. A particularly good fighter had won favor from the sponsor and might be granted freedom after the next match. A crowd favorite had died and the audience had cheered louder than ever. A beast had broken its chain and attacked a handler. The stories flew like dust, passed between men who knew each tale might soon include them. And then, the call again. This time, Gaius's name was among them. He stood. His palms were slick, his chest tight, but he moved forward with steady feet. A guard handed him a helmet. Another checked his sword's edge. The trainers watched with unreadable expressions. One of them, an older man who had once fought himself, gave Gaius a brief pat on the back. "Keep your shield high," he muttered, "and don't turn your back." That was it. Then, the archway, the tunnel, the light. As Gaius stepped into the arena, the roar of Rome hit him like a wave. The brightness blinded him for a moment. The crowd chanted. Somewhere someone called his name. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew this. For the next few minutes, every eye in the city was on him, and whatever he did now would be his legacy, whether he lived or died. The sand beneath Gaius's sandals felt softer than he had expected, yet each step was a reminder of where he was. The vast Colosseum stretched above him, tier after tier packed with faces, some curious, some hungry for violence, others simply there to pass a hot Roman afternoon with entertainment. The sun cast long shadows across the arena floor, and from high above, awnings billowed in the breeze, shifting the light in gentle waves across the crowd. He wasn't alone. Across from him stood another man, leaner, with scars cutting lines across his chest and shoulder. A murmillo, judging by the fish-crested helmet and the long rectangular shield. His weapon, a gladius, gleamed in the sun. This was a trained man, experienced. Gaius tightened his grip on his own sword and adjusted the shield strapped to his left arm. His fingers trembled slightly, but his stance was solid. There was no fanfare, no trumpet, just a nod from the official above, and the match began. They circled each other, testing. The crowd quieted, sensing the tension. Gaius kept his shield raised, just as the old trainer had told him. The murmillo made the first move, a sudden lunge, more of a test than a strike. Gaius dodged, stumbling slightly, but stayed on his feet. The Murmillo came again, this time swinging his gladius wide. Gaius blocked it with a clang that echoed through the arena, the impact jarring his whole arm. He countered, a quick jab that grazed the man's side. Not enough to wound, but enough to surprise. There was a murmur in the stands. And so, the fight continued. It was not elegant. It was not swift. It was the battle of a newcomer trying to survive and a veteran who underestimated his opponent. Each exchange left scratches on Gaius's shield, dents in his armor, and welts on his ribs. But he held firm. Then came a moment, brief, almost accidental, where the Murmillo slipped. Just a fraction. But Gaius saw it, and he acted. He stepped in, low and tight, thrusting his blade into the exposed gap beneath the man's raised arm. There was a cry, the kind that draws breath from a crowd. The Murmillo fell backward, clutching his side, blood soaking the sand. Gaius stood over him, panting, unsure what came next. Silence. Then the crowd turned toward the official. A thumb hovered in the air. Gaius could barely breathe. The Murmillo, grimacing on the ground, lifted one hand in a weak plea. Would they spare him? The thumb turned sideways, a signal not of death, but of mercy. The Murmillo was carried off. Gaius dropped his sword, his chest rising and falling with each breath like he had run across all of Gaul. Someone placed a laurel wreath on his head. Others tossed coins. He barely noticed. He was alive. He had won. And just like that, he had become more than a name on a chalkboard. Back in the depths of the Colosseum, Gaius walked slowly, cradling his arm where a strike had bruised the bone. The other fighters gave him nods, brief gestures of respect. No cheers, no celebration, only quiet acknowledgement that he had earned his place among them. That night, he sat on the edge of his cot in the dim light of an oil lamp. He replayed the fight over and over in his mind, each swing, each block, the turning point. He didn't sleep much. His body ached. But deep down, something had shifted. He had arrived as a slave. He was leaving that day as a gladiator. And though he didn't know how many days he had left, tonight at least, he'd survived Rome's hunger for blood. The sun had long dipped below the city's skyline, and the Colosseum now stood silent, its grand arches casting ghostly shadows under the flickering torchlight. Gaius lay still on his cot, the woven straw mattress offering little comfort to his battered frame. His body throbbed with a dull ache, the kind that seeps into bone. Every muscle had been pushed past its limit, but it was the silence that felt the most unfamiliar. He had survived. That realization didn't bring joy. It brought a strange calm, like the eye of a storm. The battle was behind him, but the next loomed ahead. Victories didn't mean freedom. They only meant postponing whatever fate Rome had planned next. A fellow gladiator, Marcus, passed him a clay bowl of watered-down wine. "You didn't die," he muttered with a crooked smile. "Good start." Gaius accepted it with a quiet nod. His hand shook slightly as he sipped. The liquid was bitter, barely fermented, but it helped wash the coppery taste of fear from his mouth. Around him, the barracks buzzed with muted life. Some men joked softly, others prayed. A few stared blankly at the wall, their minds caught between memory and anticipation. The ones who had survived multiple bouts, the veterans, bore faces carved with experience. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. One of them, a grizzled man known as Titus, sat sharpening a blade with rhythmic strokes. "Don't think it gets easier," he said without looking up. You just get faster at deciding whether you want to live. Gaius wasn't sure what to say. He didn't yet know what kind of man he would become in this place. Was he a survivor, a killer, or just someone waiting for the end? That night, sleep came in fits. Dreams pulled him back into the arena, where sand turned to blood and cheers warped into roars. He awoke before dawn, breath shallow, palms slick with sweat. He wasn't alone. The barracks were full of quiet stirrings, nightmares that visited many. As morning broke, a trainer entered. Not the old one who had barked orders during the drills. This man was younger, sharper-eyed. He carried a scroll and read out names. Gaius's was among them. "New match, 3 days," the trainer said. "Rest today, then prepare." 3 days, that was all he had. After a meagre breakfast of barley porridge, Gaius found himself alone in the small courtyard behind the barracks. A tree, the only one in sight, offered a patch of shade. He sat beneath it, watching a beetle crawl across the stones. For a moment, it reminded him of the farm, of days spent in the dirt, chasing insects, thinking of nothing more than food and sleep. Now, every moment held weight. Every step he took could lead to another fight, another opponent, another judgment from the crowd. But there was something else, something quiet rising beneath the fear, purpose. For the first time since his capture, Gaius felt a flicker of control. He couldn't change his chains, but he could train. He could study his foes. He could make them work for every strike they landed. That afternoon, he returned to the practice yard, alone. He lifted his training sword and began to swing, slowly at first, then with more speed. His muscles protested, his ribs ached, but he kept going. Because now, Gaius wasn't just a slave waiting for fate to find him. He was a gladiator training for his next battle, and in Rome, that meant everything. Gaius stood before the wooden rack, where weapons and shields were stored for training. The air was heavy with the scent of sweat, leather, and oiled bronze. Sunlight filtered into the yard, glinting off the polished surfaces of helms and blades. He reached out and ran his fingers along the edge of a short sword, a gladius, its weight both familiar and sobering. This was no longer a foreign object. It had become an extension of his body, not just a tool for survival, but a symbol of the life he had been thrust into. Nearby, an older gladiator named Septimus watched silently. He was known for his calm, calculating style. While others fought with fire, Septimus fought with focus. He approached Gaius now, offering a nod and a few words. "It's not about strength," he said, voice low. "It's about rhythm. Feel the beat of the fight, and you'll always be a step ahead." Gaius listened closely. He had come to respect these quiet moments, the passing of wisdom from fighter to fighter. In a world where trust was rare and life uncertain, shared knowledge was a kind of currency. Their trainer barked orders, and the men fell into formation. Today's drills were about endurance, long hours beneath the sun, shield raised, sword steady. Gaius moved through the motions, his mind half in the yard and half in the arena. He imagined enemies in front of him, not sandbags or straw dummies. Real men, real death. As he blocked and struck, his thoughts wandered to the crowd, how they screamed not just for blood, but for performance. A good kill was not enough. It had to be memorable, dramatic, entertaining. He hated that, and yet he knew he'd have to play along. Later that day, Gaius sat alone on a bench beneath the covered walkway that lined the yard. His arms trembled with fatigue, but he welcomed the soreness. Pain meant progress. He closed his eyes and listened. The scrape of sandals on stone, the distant hammering of repairs on the amphitheatre, the laughter of guards sharing wine nearby. Rome was alive, its pulse constant, its appetite endless. A young slave boy approached with a cloth and a bowl of cool water. Gaius nodded in thanks and poured some over his head, letting the rivulets run down his face and chest. It didn't wash away the burden he carried, but it softened the edges. As evening neared, the barracks quieted. Men mended their gear, checked leather straps, whispered prayers. Gaius sat at the edge of his cot, rubbing oil into a scar forming along his ribs. A shallow cut, but a reminder. He remembered his first sight of the Colosseum's interior. How massive it felt, how small he had seemed. It hadn't changed, but he had. He no longer trembled at its size. Instead, he measured it in steps, in sword lengths, in distances to be closed, ground to be gained. Night fell slowly, and the torches were lit. Shadows danced along the walls. A few men played dice in a corner. Others sharpened blades, silent and focused. Gaius lay back, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his family, his father's hands, rough from years of labour. His mother's songs while cooking lentils. Would they recognise him now? Would he? Tomorrow would bring more training. The day after, perhaps another name drawn, another fight. But tonight, he allowed himself the luxury of stillness. The weight of steel, of purpose, of survival. It was heavy. But for the first time, Gaius carried it with pride. In the months that followed, Gaius began to notice the subtle shift in how others looked at him. No longer the untested recruit, the farm boy with wide eyes and soft hands. He was now a known name in the barracks. His fights had earned him a reputation, not for brutality or showmanship, but for precision and quiet strength. He didn't taunt, didn't grandstand. He simply fought and won. He was called the Ox by some, not because of his size, but for his steady, relentless style. In a world where flair often meant survival, Gaius had carved out a different path. He fought like a plough through soil, cutting a clean and purposeful line. It was this reputation that caught the attention of the lanista, the man who managed their training and contracts. One morning, as the men broke their fast with bread and olives, a messenger arrived with word that Gaius was to be summoned to the lanista's office. He walked through the corridors of the ludus, past men sharpening blades and wrapping wrists, until he reached the heavy wooden door. Inside, the lanista sat behind a broad desk, flanked by 2 guards. His face, worn from years of business, was unreadable. "You've drawn attention," the lanista said plainly. "The governor of the province has requested your appearance at a private match. You'll be well compensated. Win or lose, your name will grow." Gaius nodded slowly. He knew this was not a request, but an order. The match was held days later in a smaller arena on the outskirts of the city. A more intimate setting, with fewer seats, but with more powerful eyes watching. Senators, merchants, and military men reclined in shaded stands, sipping wine and murmuring as the gladiators prepared behind the scenes. His opponent was a man named Rutillus, a veteran from Gaul, with a scarred face and arms thick as tree trunks. He was known for his aggressive style and for rarely leaving his enemies alive. Gaius studied him from a distance, noting the way he paced, how he checked his gear, the confidence in his stride. When the gate opened and the 2 men stepped into the sand, the crowd hushed. The sun was high, the heat baking down on their shoulders. They saluted the governor, then each other. The match began with cautious circling. Rutillus lunged first, his curved blade slicing toward Gaius's ribs. Gaius stepped back, deflecting the blow with his shield, then responded with a low sweep of his own gladius. Sparks flew from metal striking metal. Minutes passed in a blur of movement and sweat. The crowd gasped and clapped, calling out in Latin, cheering for blood. But Gaius remained locked in, every breath timed, every movement measured. He waited for his moment. It came when Rutulus overreached with a downward strike, leaving his side exposed. Gaius pivoted, slamming his shoulder into the larger man's chest and knocking him off balance. As Rutulus stumbled, Gaius brought his blade around in a controlled arc, drawing a deep line across the man's thigh. Rutulus dropped to one knee. The match wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted. The final blow, when it came, was clean. Not fatal, but decisive. Gaius pressed his blade to the veteran's throat and looked to the governor, a thumb turned upward. Mercy. He stepped back. Rutulus dropped his weapon and bowed his head. The crowd roared, not just for the fight, but for the restraint. Back in the barracks that night, Gaius sat in silence. The other men clapped him on the back, some with pride, others with envy. He had taken another step, not just as a fighter, but as a symbol. He thought about the path that had led him here, about the fields he once tended, about the boy he used to be. Somewhere along the way, that boy had become a gladiator, not just in body, but in mind and in reputation. The match with Rutulus left more than a scar on Gaius's thigh. It left a mark on his standing. Among the gladiators, he was now seen as one of the top ranks, someone whose name could draw a crowd. But outside the ludus, in the streets and whispers of the city, his fame was beginning to echo as well. Children played at sword fights in the alleyways, calling themselves the Ox, in imitation of his steady power. Vendors near the amphitheatre carved his likeness into wooden trinkets or stamped it onto cheap bronze tokens. He would walk the market with his hood drawn low, but still, someone would catch a glimpse and nudge their companion with wide eyes. With fame came certain privileges. The meals became a little warmer, the water a bit cleaner. He was given a slightly larger room, a cot that didn't wobble with every turn, and occasional solitude. The lanista trusted him more, not as a man, but as an asset. When rich men visited the training grounds, Gaius was often asked to demonstrate drills or spar with elegance. He was a showpiece, but Gaius felt no pride in it. There was something hollow about being admired for violence. He was good at it. He couldn't deny that anymore. But it still felt like a mask he wore, one he couldn't fully remove. One evening, as the sun dipped low and washed the stone walls of the ludus in soft orange light, Gaius found himself standing atop the training yard wall, overlooking the city. The forum was visible in the distance, bustling with carts and crowds. Further still, the hills beyond the city glowed golden with wild grass, whispering of freedom he hadn't felt in years. Flavius approached, his footsteps light despite the brace on his leg. The two had become something like friends, not out of choice, but out of familiarity. They had trained together, bled together, and eaten many a meal in silence. That kind of bond didn't need words. "Nice view," Flavius said, leaning against the parapet. Gaius nodded. "Did you ever think," Flavius continued, "we'd be standing here, talking about freedom?" Gaius didn't answer immediately. "Sometimes I dream of it. Not in big ways, just walking through a field without a sword on my back, watching the clouds move." Flavius chuckled. The mighty ox, dreaming of clouds. "Do you still?" Gaius asked. Flavius paused. "I used to. I still do, maybe. but the fight gets in your blood. Even if you walk free, it doesn't leave you. That's the trick. They stood together in silence, listening to the city breathe below them. The next day brought new rumors of an upcoming festival sponsored by a visiting senator from Rome. A grand spectacle was planned, and names were being drawn from across the empire. Gladiators from distant provinces were arriving in the city, each hoping to win gold, freedom, or glory. And Gaius's name, it seemed, was already carved into the center of the board. The lanista summoned him again, laying out the plan. "You're the closing act," he said. 3 matches, final day. The crowd will be at its loudest. Don't die. Gaius blinked slowly. Who are the opponents? A Thracian named Daos, a Scissor from Alexandria, and a Retiarius they're calling the Ghost. Gaius knew what that meant. 3 different weapons, 3 different styles, 3 different ways to lose. He would have to train harder than ever. The days blurred into repetition, footwork drills, sparring with varied weapons, building endurance. Every evening, his muscles ached and his knuckles swelled, but his mind stayed sharp. He visualized each opponent, each likely move, each counter. The barracks buzzed with anticipation. Some were jealous, some were excited, most were scared. One night, Flavius approached with a small, rolled parchment. "You've got fans now," he said with a crooked smile. "Someone left this at the gate." Gaius unrolled it. It was a crude sketch, a drawing of him standing tall, sword raised, with a crowd in the background. Below it, a child's hand had scrawled, "The ox is brave." For the first time in weeks, Gaius smiled. Not because he felt brave, but because someone believed he was. The sun rose over Capua in hues of copper and gold, bathing the city in a festive glow. Flags and garlands lined the streets. Shopkeepers swept dust from their doorways, and the smell of roasting meats and fresh bread wafted through the air. The day of the games had arrived. Inside the ludus, the mood was tense but focused. Gladiators were being adorned in ceremonial gear, their armor polished until it gleamed. Painted shields, bright plumes, and ornate greaves gave them the look of mythical warriors. But beneath the shine, their faces remained grim. Each knew the truth. Beneath the roar of the crowd and the shimmer of spectacle, blood would be spilled. Gaius sat quietly on a bench, his sword resting across his lap. His hands were steady, though his stomach churned. He had fought before, many times, but today felt different. This wasn't just another match. This was a test, a gauntlet of skill and endurance, a show for the senator and the thousands who would watch from the stands. A slave approached, offering him water and bread. Gaius took a small bite, then glanced around. Many of the younger fighters looked pale, their hands shaking as they fumbled with their belts and straps. A few muttered prayers to Mars, to Fortuna, even to ancestors long gone. He spotted Flavius, leaning on a crutch, watching from a shaded corner. The older man gave a small nod of encouragement. Gaius returned it, grateful for even that quiet moment of solidarity. Then the gates opened. The noise hit him like a wave. A wall of sound, cheers, drum beats, the stamp of sandals on stone, rose from the amphitheatre like thunder. Gaius stepped into the sun, blinking against the brightness. The arena stretched before him, a circle of pale sand enclosed by towering walls. At the far end, in a shaded balcony, the senator reclined on a couch draped in red and gold. His entourage sipped wine, tossing olives to their dogs as they waited for the show to begin. The first opponent was Daos, the Thracian, shorter than Gaius, but quick, whipcord lean, with a curved seeker and a round shield. They saluted each other with their blades, then took positions. The trumpet blared. Daus lunged. Gaius sidestepped, raising his shield to block the strike. The seeker hissed past, carving air. He countered with a diagonal slash, but Daus rolled under it, springing back to his feet with surprising grace. The crowd gasped and clapped, delighted by the display. Back and forth they danced, strikes, dodges, feints. Gaius kept his breathing steady, conserving energy. He waited for an opening, and when Daus overreached, he swept the man's legs with his shield and brought his gladius down hard across the Thracian's shoulder. The man collapsed, groaning. The crowd roared. The emperor looked to the stands, his hand raised. The crowd responded with a chorus of thumbs, some up, some down. The lanista leaned in and whispered. The senator nodded. The thumbs stayed up. Daus would live. Gaius bowed and stepped back, sweat pouring down his neck. His muscles trembled, but there was no time to rest. Slaves rushed to smooth the sand, dragging Daus off the field as a new fighter entered. The Scissor from Alexandria. He was taller, broader, his armor darker. One arm ended in a curved blade, the other in a reinforced vambrace shaped like a crescent. His helmet had no eye holes, just slits, giving him the look of a bird of prey. Gaius adjusted his grip. This would be harder. The Scissor charged without preamble, his bladed arms slicing through the air in heavy, looping arcs. Gaius ducked the first strike, then sidestepped the second. But the man was relentless, pushing forward with brutal efficiency. Gaius was forced to give ground, dodging and parrying, his shield splintering under the blows. Then he slipped, just for a moment, one foot sliding in the blood-soaked sand, but enough for the Scissor to close in. The blade raked across Gaius's forearm, drawing blood. Pain flared, sharp and white-hot. Gaius growled, pushing himself upright. He raised his sword, feinted left, then struck to the right, scoring a hit across the Scissor's thigh. The man grunted, but didn't fall. They circled again. The clash felt endless. Every muscle in Gaius's body burned. But as the sun reached its peak and the sand grew hot beneath his feet, he saw it, the moment of overconfidence. The Scissor lifted his arm too high. Gaius ducked under it, slammed his shield into the man's chest, and drove his gladius upward beneath the armoured plate. The Scissor dropped with a hollow gasp. Gaius staggered back, breathing hard, covered in blood that wasn't all his. 2 down, 1 more to go. And the crowd was on its feet. The crowd had barely settled from the last match when the next contender emerged. There was a tension in the air now, something heavier than before. It wasn't just another fight. This one was whispered about in the rows of spectators, murmured between goblets of wine and slices of melon. Even the vendors had stopped shouting. All eyes turned to the arena. Out stepped Marcus Varro. He was a veteran, known in Capua and beyond. A mumio, like Gaius, but older, thicker, more deliberate in his steps. His helmet bore a crimson plume, and his breastplate had dents from battles past. He carried a wide rectangular shield and a sword that looked almost too familiar. Years ago, Gaius had trained beside this man. Now they would meet not as comrades, but as entertainment. Gaius felt something shift inside him. Not fear, exactly, but a cold realization. This would be a real fight. They didn't salute this time. The trumpet didn't need to sound. The crowd quieted. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, the 2 men stepped forward. Their shields crashed first. The heavy clang echoed off the walls. Then came the swords, Swift, sharp arcs that sparked as metal met metal. The sound was thunderous, rhythmic. Each swing carried weight, memory, and history. Varro moved like a seasoned bear, each step measured, each block efficient. He wasn't fast, but he didn't need to be. Gaius, already weary from 2 bouts, tried to keep his movements fluid. He dodged when he could, absorbed hits when he must. But Varro's strikes were beginning to land. A hard blow to the ribs sent Gaius stumbling. His shield arm trembled, his vision blurred. But somewhere inside, he found a sliver of resolve. He remembered his first day in the Ludus, the lashings, the hunger, the cruel bark of the drill master. He remembered why he fought. For survival, for something like freedom, for the hope, however faint, of one day walking away. He parried the next strike, then twisted and jabbed his blade into Varro's thigh. The older man hissed, stepping back. It wasn't deep, but it was enough. Gaius pressed forward, landing 2 more blows. One to the shoulder, another across the helmet. Varro growled and slammed his shield into Gaius's chest, sending him sprawling to the sand. Time froze. Gaius lay there, gasping, tasting blood. The sun beat down. He rolled, just in time to avoid a downward slash that split the ground where his head had been. He kicked upward, connecting with Varro's knee. The Murmillo stumbled. Gaius was on his feet again, ignoring the screaming in his ribs. Their swords locked once more, and in a final, desperate move, Gaius let go of his shield, ducked inside Varro's guard, and drove his sword up into the armpit, the one place the armor didn't cover. Varro's eyes widened behind the grill of his helmet. He sank to one knee, and then collapsed. The arena fell silent. Gaius stood alone, sword lowered, chest heaving. The senator rose from his seat. He raised his hand. The crowd held its breath. Then came the thumb, upward. Relief flooded Gaius's limbs. He dropped to his knees, not in show, but from sheer exhaustion. Slaves rushed in to lift him, to tend his wounds. Flowers were thrown from the stands. Musicians began to play. But for Gaius, it was all a distant hum. He had survived. He had won, but it wasn't victory that filled his heart. It was emptiness. And somewhere deep inside, the faint hope that perhaps this would be his last time beneath the sun-soaked sand. The cool darkness of the underground chambers welcomed Gaius like a second skin. The transition from the sunlit roar of the arena to the quiet stone corridors was always abrupt. Even with the pain humming through his limbs, even with the blood drying on his skin, he found a strange comfort in the familiar scent of oil, sweat, and stone. He leaned on a young slave's shoulder, too tired to speak. His legs wobbled beneath him. The adrenaline had faded, and in its place was raw exhaustion. His ribs ached with every breath, and the gash on his thigh still bled steadily. But he was alive. As they reached the small treatment alcove, an old physician muttered something and began to clean his wounds. The man was gentle, his touch surprisingly soft for someone who had seen so much suffering. Gaius winced, but didn't resist. This pain, at least, was purposeful. Across the room, another gladiator coughed violently. Someone else groaned. A lanista paced outside, shouting orders to slaves about the next day's schedule. Life continued, even when yours felt like it had paused. Gaius lay back on the stone bench. He stared up at the ceiling, where the faint flicker of torchlight played across uneven bricks. He wasn't thinking of victory. He wasn't even thinking of freedom. He was thinking of Varro. The man had lived. Barely. The wound had missed anything vital, the medic said. But he would never fight again. That much was clear. And that in this world, was a different kind of sentence. Gaius remembered when they'd trained together. Varro had once snuck him a piece of bread when he was new and starving. He'd once joked about retiring to a vineyard somewhere far from Rome's reach. Now, he'd be lucky to walk. And what of Gaius? What was his reward? He'd be paraded tomorrow, fed and rested. His name whispered in corners of the city, perhaps even placed in a match with greater stakes, one that involved gold, senators, prestige, or worse. He turned his head slightly and saw a bowl of wine on the table beside him. A gift, perhaps. He took a slow sip. It was watered down and tart, but it steadied him. Outside, he could hear the murmurs of the city, carts rolling over cobblestone, the echo of sandals, someone laughing far off. Somewhere above this very chamber, a feast would be held tonight in his honour. Men in robes would toast to his strength. Women would fan themselves and ask what he looked like beneath the helmet. And he would remain here, bleeding in the dark. He thought of his mother. Her face was soft in his memory, blurred by time. But he remembered her hands, calloused, always warm. She used to tell him bedtime stories about wolves and gods, about heroes who defied kings and built cities. He wondered what she'd say if she saw him now. A champion, a killer, a survivor. He didn't know how much longer he would last. But for now, he had earned another day, and in the world of a gladiator, sometimes that was the greatest prize of all. While Gaius recovered in the shadows, far above the gladiator quarters, Rome's elite gathered beneath chandeliers and gold-leafed ceilings. The domus of Senator Cassius pulsed with laughter and music. Bronze trays of roasted figs and honeyed meats passed from hand to hand, and goblets of wine reflected the glow of oil lamps hanging from carved lion heads. Gaius's name floated between lips glazed in wine. "A thrilling match," said one elderly patrician, swirling his cup. "That new Thracian nearly had him, though." I held my breath. "Gaius won't last another season," muttered another. "They all wear out, don't they? Even the good ones." Livia, a young senator's daughter in fine linen, leaned forward, eyes wide with curiosity. "Do they truly train with real blades?" "Of course," her father scoffed. "That's why the blood is real. Why we pay." Across the room, Senator Cassius stood near the atrium, deep in conversation with two men dressed not in togas but in dark cloaks. Their voices were low, serious. One held a scroll, sealed in wax. Politics stirred in the background of every feast. Whispered names, plotted alliances, quiet threats. "They say Gaius might be champion next month," said one of the cloaked men. "If he survives, it would make for quite the show during the consul's election." Cassius nodded slowly. "Then we will ensure he does. A public favourite is a useful blade, but only for as long as he draws breath." Below them, Gaius sneezed. The scent of old hay and ointment filled his nose. He shifted on the bench, his body protesting even that small movement. He had no idea that his name was currency tonight. No clue that while he lay wounded, sipping watered wine, Rome spun a web around him. In the bath chamber, a former gladiator, older and blind in one eye, leaned against the wall beside him. "Did you win?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "I did," Gaius murmured. The old man smiled, toothless. "Good. That means you'll fight again." There was no triumph in the words, only the certainty of repetition. Far above, Livia asked softly, "Do gladiators dream, do you think?" Her uncle laughed. "If they do, it's a freedom, and they always wake up disappointed." Gaius closed his eyes and the sounds of the chamber faded. The world above him buzzed with games, gossip, and power. But he had won his battle. For tonight, at least, the price had been paid. By the following sunrise, Gaius was already back on his feet. Not because his body was ready, but because the Lanista demanded it. The sun barely touched the tiled roofs of the Ludus when the heavy iron gate creaked open and the guards barked out names. Gaius limped into the morning mist with the others, muscles stiff, ribs aching. He bore the bruises of yesterday, but wore the stoic face of tomorrow. The training yard was quieter today. The younger recruits practiced footwork in the corner, their wooden swords tapping with clumsy rhythm. In the centre, a single man sparred in silence, his movements fluid and coldly efficient. This was Darius, the reigning champion of the arena, a murmillo known across Rome for his ruthless precision. He had once cleaved a man's helmet in two. He glanced at Gaius with dark, impassive eyes. "Still breathing, farm boy?" "Barely," Gaius grunted, taking a seat nearby. Darius circled slowly, sword dragging a faint line through the dust. "You win too much," he said without looking. "People will expect more. You'll lose their love the moment you hesitate." Gaius didn't answer. He understood now that love in Rome was a double-edged thing, sharp and fleeting. The champion sheathed his blade. "You know what they ask me before every fight?" he said, walking over. "They ask me to smile. The people like it, they say. Look proud, look fearless. But you know what I feel?" Gaius shook his head. "Nothing," Darius whispered. "I feel nothing. That's how you survive." He turned and walked away. Later that day, as the sun climbed higher, Gaius was summoned to the dressing quarters beneath the arena. A new tunic, fresh bandages, and a polished helmet awaited him. It was an honor, he was told. He would be featured in a portrait for the arena's upcoming festival. A Greek artist waited with oils and parchment, adjusting his stool. "Stand there, chin up. Yes, perfect." Gaius held the pose, sword at his side, face expressionless. But his mind wandered, back to the olive trees of his childhood, the warmth of his mother's bread, the sound of his brother laughing as they chased goats down the hillside. The artist dabbed at the canvas. "You look like a hero," he murmured. Gaius stared into the torchlit wall, heart heavy. He wasn't a hero. He was a man caught in the teeth of a machine that fed on flesh and applause. The portrait would hang in the entryway, they said, where crowds could admire him on their way to see the blood. That evening, back in the quarters, a boy brought him a bowl of stew and a scrap of cloth, his mother's old sash, sent from the countryside. The boy said nothing, just smiled and ran off. Gaius held the fabric in his calloused hands. It smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. He pressed it to his cheek, closed his eyes, and sat still, while the echoes of swords clashed in the distance. Tomorrow he would wear the mask again, but tonight he was simply a son. Morning in the arena came not with birdsong, but with shouting. Vendors hawked olives and figs, crusty bread and cups of watered wine. Somewhere, a flute squeaked out a merry tune, while the scent of sweat, dust, and anticipation hung thick in the air. Gaius stood behind the iron grate that separated the fighters from the rising stands, his helmet in his hand and his eyes fixed on the sky above. It was bright today, clear, cruel in its perfection. Beside him, another gladiator named Marcus paced. "Big crowd," he muttered, peering through the bars. "Maybe the emperor will show." Gaius said nothing. His fingers traced the edge of the cloth sash tied to his wrist, a reminder of something gentler than this place. The gate began to rise. The crowd roared. And like cattle to the slaughter, they stepped forward into the light. The arena floor was hot beneath his sandals, sand scattered in clouds beneath each step. Across from him, 2 Thraex fighters in feathered helmets waited, curved swords gleaming. Gaius could barely hear the announcer's words over the cheer, but it didn't matter. The script was always the same. Bread for the people, blood for the gods. The fight was swift, not easy, never easy, but Gaius had learned. He moved like water, blocked like stone, and struck like thunder. One opponent fell with a groan. The other followed, breath hissing through broken ribs. He stood there, chest heaving, blade lowered. The crowd was on its feet, but no death blow was given. From the stands came a pause, then a signal. The crowd's mercy. A rare thing these days. Back in the depths of the ludus, Gaius sat alone. Blood stained his tunic. His hand trembled slightly as he drank from a cup of stale water. The boy who had delivered his mother's sash came in quietly, sweeping around his feet. "You didn't kill them," the boy whispered. "No," Gaius said. "Not today." The boy tilted his head. "Will you be free soon?" Gaius smiled faintly. Freedom in Rome isn't a door, it's a maze. That night, the city pulsed with torches. Gaius watched from the shadows of a rooftop, arms crossed. He wasn't supposed to be there, but he needed to breathe something other than iron and sweat. Below, a group of musicians played near the market. A girl laughed. Somewhere, wine spilled. He wondered how many people down there had ever thought about the men behind the helmets, the lives beneath the sand. Not many, he guessed. But maybe someday someone would, and that was enough for now. The next day dawned softer, and for once there were no scheduled fights. The arena was silent. The gates closed. Gaius welcomed the stillness, as though it were a warm cloak. He lay on his back in the barracks courtyard, watching the clouds drift lazily across the Roman sky. The other men were scattered, some gambling, some sleeping, a few whispering prayers in their native tongues. Even the trainers seemed subdued, their barking orders replaced with quiet nods. The absence of bloodshed felt surreal. Gaius rose and wandered toward the scribe's alcove, a place rarely visited by fighters. There, scrolls lined the walls, filled with records of names, victories, and deaths. One of the scribes, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, glanced up from his parchment. "Curious?" he asked. "About the dead," Gaius replied. The scribe nodded and gestured to a long scroll. "These are the names of those who never left the arena." Gaius scanned the list. Some names he recognized. Others were only letters now, all their hopes reduced to ink and silence. At the bottom of the page, a blank space waited. The scribe raised an eyebrow. "Do you want yours written?" "Not yet." Later that afternoon, Gaius helped repair a broken sparring dummy. The wood had splintered after one too many practice blows. As he worked, a younger recruit named Cassius approached, wide-eyed and restless. "Is it true?" he asked. "You once beat 3 men in a single match." Gaius gave a half smile. "I've survived 3. That's not quite the same." Cassius knelt beside him, watching the way he tied the wooden limbs. "What does it feel like when you win?" Gaius paused. "Like I've bought myself one more night of sleep." That evening, the men sat around a shared meal of lentils and coarse bread. Someone passed around a jug of wine. They didn't toast victories or chant battle songs. They simply talked. About home, about the food they missed, the rivers they used to swim in, the people who might still be waiting for them. When the stars came out, Gaius walked alone to the edge of the training yard. He looked up at the same night sky he had once seen from his father's farm. The constellations hadn't changed, but he had. He was no longer the boy who had dreamed of the army, nor the fresh recruit who believed glory would bring peace. He was something else now, a survivor. And in that quiet space between battles, where blood was not yet spilled and swords remained sheathed, Gaius found the faintest trace of freedom, not in escape, but in remembering who he was before Rome carved a number into his back. The next day, the arena was open once more, but it wasn't filled with the usual roar of bloodthirsty citizens. This was a festival day, a lighter celebration where the mood was more playful, the crowd less savage. There would be no deaths, only exhibitions, the kind of display designed to entertain children and diplomats rather than satisfy darker appetites. Gaius stood at the edge of the sand, not dressed for war, but in a polished, ceremonial version of his usual gear. His helmet gleamed under the sun, and a scarlet cloak had been draped over one shoulder. He felt like a statue, hollow and immobile. The crowd murmured with anticipation as he entered. Among them, seated in the shaded stone benches, were senators, traders, and visiting dignitaries. Their faces were unreadable, their hands resting on goblets of wine and platters of roasted meats. Across the arena, his opponent stepped forward, a younger man, likely new to the ludus, wearing a wolfskin pelt over his shoulders. The fight would be choreographed, designed to impress, not to kill. Still, Gaius could see the nervous stiffness in the youth's gait. The wooden swords clacked together, rehearsed and careful. They danced in circles, drawing gasps from the crowd whenever a spin or near miss occurred. Gaius slowed his movements, subtly guiding the fight to flatter the boy, giving him moments to shine. The crowd responded with applause. Children pointed and laughed with wide eyes. For a fleeting moment, Gaius imagined they were cheering for him, not as a killer, but as a character in a story. A hero, perhaps. Later, as he exited the arena, he overheard two noblewomen speaking behind their fans. "He moved like a lion," one said. "Or a ghost," the other replied. Back in the shadows of the corridor, Gaius removed his helmet and exhaled. A servant girl offered him water. Her hands trembled slightly as she passed him the jug. He accepted it with a nod of thanks, and she lingered for a moment. "I saw you," she whispered. "You could have ended it, but you didn't." "I don't fight boys," Gaius said simply. She gave him a shy glance, then disappeared down the hall. That evening, he sat near the training yard, watching the sunset paint the barracks walls in warm gold. The younger fighters began practicing again, energized by the day's applause. Gaius knew this feeling wouldn't last. The real matches would return. The sand would be soaked again. But today, there had been laughter, faces without fear, and for a few heartbeats, he hadn't felt like a slave. As the stars crept into view, he whispered quietly to himself, "Let them remember me like this, just for today." In the days that followed the exhibition match, something shifted around Gaius. Not in the sand of the arena or the routines of the ludus, but in the quiet moments, the glances exchanged with other gladiators, the softened tones from his lanista, even the rare nods from patricians who once looked through him. The servant girl, Julia, brought him water again. This time her hand didn't shake. She sat nearby as he tended to his armor. "You fight differently," she said. "Not like the others." Gaius kept polishing the greave on his knee, not looking up. "I fight like a man who wants to leave something behind." "Like what?" He paused, then finally met her eyes. "A memory, not of blood, Not of screams, just someone who tried. She stayed silent, but her presence beside him said more than any words. One evening, a letter arrived. It was sealed with unfamiliar wax. Unrolling the scroll, Gaius read it slowly. A senator had offered to sponsor his manumission, his freedom. There were no promises, only a possibility. A performance at a private villa, one final display, and in return, his chains might be broken. He didn't celebrate. He sat with the letter in his lap, listening to the sounds of the training yard behind him. The clang of metal, the thud of feet on packed earth. His world. Later that night, Gaius walked the edge of the arena, alone. The moonlight painted the stone walls silver. He reached down, pressed his hand into the cold sand, and felt every moment that had passed there. Every scream, every cheer, every breath he'd stolen from fate. He didn't know if freedom would be better. He didn't know if a man like him could belong anywhere else, but he knew he had to try. As he stood and turned to leave, the faint wind carried the sound of applause. Not real, but remembered. It echoed from the walls like a phantom audience, one that had watched him live, fight, and somehow remain human. He whispered a farewell to the ghost of the arena, then walked away.